being involved in throwing an actual World Series, I think everybody would agree that's far worse than the Rose aspect there if we're just talking about the gambling, because Pete Rose always said, I only bet on my own team to win.
It's time for Sportsnaut's MLB podcast. Big League Buzz, news and interviews from around the majors. Here's your host, Scott Gulbranson.
Welcome back to Big League Buzz, and today we're talking about the big news from earlier in this week. That is the Commissioner of Baseball, Rob Manfred, lifted the lifetime ban on 16 players, all of which are deceased. Two of those names might be very familiar to you, though. Of course, Pete Rose, Shoeless Joe Jackson are two of them. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Will they make it into the Hall of Fame? Why or why shouldn't they? And to do that, we bring in Matt Snyder, who's a CBS Sports Major League Baseball writer, also a Hall of Fame voter and Hall of Fame analyst. So we wanted to go right to somebody who is knee deep in the Hall of Fame to get his opinion. And he wrote a piece recently about this. So we wanted to talk to him. Matt, thanks for being with us here on Big League Buzz.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
All right. So we look at this situation. We know Rose, Jackson, 15 other players permanently banned. They had them lifted, these lifetime bans. All of them, of course, have passed on. The decision to allow these players to be unbanned in Esalen, I mean, this goes everything from gambling to other scandals, and to be considered now for induction into the Baseball Hall of Fame. We start, of course, with Pete Rose, the most recent. And you wrote about this and you said, out of all of these players, and we'll get into some of the others later, but Pete Rose is the most likely to be inducted. Yeah. Obviously, the hits leader still, and everybody knows this story well, gambled on baseball, including his own team, not charged or accused of throwing games or any of that. But when you look at that, is that why out of all of these players that were just had their bans lifted, is that why he has, if he does have a chance to get into the Hall of Fame, more so than anyone else?
It's all pieces of the puzzle. I think you can start with, he by far, if you ignore all the noise and you only look at the on-field Hall of Fame case, he has the easiest open and shut case there is. It's no matter which way you look at it. If you want to, a lot of people look at the WAR and JAWS aspect nowadays. He's sixth among left fielders, and those behind five of the best players who ever played baseball. Barry Bonds, Ted Williams are up there, Ricky Henderson. Shoeless Joe in right fielders is down like 14th. Nobody else is even sniffing the conversation. But yeah, I think the next piece of the puzzle is, if you think somebody stained the game, how badly did they stain the game? And if it's not a black and white case, and if it's gray here, how much did somebody violate the sanctity of the game? I guess you could say. And being involved in throwing an actual World Series, I think everybody would agree that's far worse than the Rose aspect there, if we're just talking about the gambling, because Pete Rose always said, I only bet on my own team to win. I still think there are problems with that. And everybody's heard the arguments. Everybody's heard, if you didn't bet on your team every single day, then you're basically betting against your team when you didn't bet, blah, blah, blah. We don't need to get into all that, because it doesn't actually matter, because there's no evidence that he ever bet on a World Series when he was in the World Series. So he's still separate from the Black Sox scandal, which is what Shoeless Joe Jackson was alleged to have been involved in. And we don't really need to dive into the weeds on Shoeless Joe to see that his Hall of Fame case on the field is not as good as Pete Rose's. Mm-hmm. And he was involved somehow with the throwing of a World Series, and that stains the game a lot more than betting on your own team. So that's how we arrive at Pete's the easy and obvious number one, if you ranked the guys.
Yeah, and I want to get into the Jackson case in a minute, because I think there's a lot. I was, until recently, and I'm a baseball nut, right? Until recently, I had a false sense that I knew the whole story about Joe Jackson. So we'll get into that. But with Pete Rose, too, as a Hall of Fame voter, because this is, I think, where people sometimes don't understand the thought process that a voter goes through. And with Pete Rose, clearly with this one, he would go to the classic baseball era committee, correct?
Yes.
And to your point, they have to consider that. Now, there's a lot of other things with Pete Rose. There's a lot of, I think, popular support for him to get, and he just passed. And of course, just in Cincinnati this week, they honored him with a night. And so I think a lot of people are in this forgiveness mode, fan-wise. But when it comes to the voters, there's, Pete Rose had a lot of other things happen off the field besides the gambling. And how much of that character issue and all those other things are going to factor into the decision making of a voter like you? And then for those of you on that classic era committee, how much does that come into play?
Um, I will never have a chance, it doesn't look like, to weigh in on it. No, it doesn't look like he's going to go on the BBWA ballot. The era ballots are tough
Mm,
because there's only 16 people, and they usually use Hall of Famers, former front office executives. They'll have one or two media people, but it's nobody like little old me. I mean, it's people the
mm,
stature of like Bob Costas, who would be the Peter Gammons, who would be the media types, who would be on that. So it depends on the makeup of the committee, really, and how much they want to, weigh everything there. It depends on the way that the conversation goes in that room, because unlike BBWA voters who get a ballot and can send it in without talking to anybody, if you want, you don't have to interact on social media. The 16 of those people on that committee sit in a room in the winter meetings together in person and discuss for hours. And we've heard stories about how when Harold Baines got in, Tony La Russa was basically pounding the table in favor of Harold Baines, and he swayed enough people to get Harold Baines voted in. By the same token, the last committee vote that included like Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and Curt Schilling, Theo Epstein was in there. Several other Red Sox people were in there. And I think a lot of fans saw that and thought, oh, they're just trying to get Curt Schilling in. But
mm.
Schilling only got like 3 of the 16 votes. Sometimes it doesn't go how you think it's going to go. Um, we have no way of knowing how it might go until we see who's on the committee. And even then, when we see who's on the committee, we just don't know. It's going to be very interesting to see how many votes he gets. If I had to guess, 12 out of 16 is a high bar. It feels like Major League Baseball probably wants him in, or else they wouldn't have gone through with this, because let's be real, this was all about Pete Rose. I mean, as much as people want to talk about Shoeless Joe Jackson, nobody at this point cares about any of those people from the 1920s or earlier. It was all about Pete Rose, and it was either you reinstate Pete Rose with all these other guys, or you don't reinstate anybody. So this was just all of Pete Rose. But if Major League Baseball wants him in, they're not necessarily
Right.
connected to the Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame is a separate entity. I don't know if the Hall of Fame wants him in, because the Hall changed their rules after Rose was banned to say people permanently ineligible are not eligible for the Hall of Fame. It was like they did not want Rose in at the time. They didn't have to change those rules. They could have put him on the ballot. But it's different leadership at the Hall of Fame now. I
Oh,
mean,
no.
I'm sorry if I'm talking in circles, but it's just so there's just so many layers to this, but there's so much unknown. I'm inclined to believe that he will
On the
not
first
get
try.
in,
Yeah.
at least on
Yeah.
the first try. It's 12 out of 16 people, and there are a lot of Hall of
Yeah.
Famers who just don't want him in. I mean, it's if you went, for example, if similar to what I said about the Curt Schilling thing was, if they tried to go Cincinnati route and they put like Johnny Bench in there, I don't think Johnny Bench wants him in.
Yeah.
So and their votes are never made public. So it's not like you have to face the scorn of the public for your vote. We just know how many people
Yeah, and it's
voted and
interesting
how many
to
votes they
think
got.
about, because you hear when modern players who are still playing the game talk about Pete Rose, there's much more adulation, right? We know that over time, there's more of a feeling of forgiveness, and so perhaps, like you said, maybe not the first ballot, but the second time he's brought up, or third time, who knows when? But
It's interesting. He's grown larger than life
yeah,
because of the ban. Really, I mean, it was already Charlie Hustle. He was already a very popular player. Um, there was lore about him. The hits record is a big deal because everybody. The most basic thing in Little League was always you try to get a hit, and if he got the most hits ever, he must be one of the greatest hitters ever. I honestly think that he's grown into historically the most
wow,
famous baseball player ever, like over Babe Ruth, because of the ban. If it wasn't because of the ban, he wouldn't even be close. But I do think he's more famous than Babe Ruth at this time, just to the casual sports fan who's not even a baseball fan. They've all heard of Pete Rose, especially
oh
now with
yes,
Donald Trump inserting himself into the conversation. It's a snowball rolling downhill and just gathering
right.
more and more
And Matt,
momentum.
now
Um, I honestly, sorry, but I think he might also be one of the most overrated players of all time at this point, because again, the legend grows and grows and grows to the point that I've got people yelling at me saying he's the greatest
it is
player
weird.
ever. That's ridiculous. He's not even close to the greatest player ever. It's between, if we ranked them all, he'd
Yeah.
be between like 50 It's just he's not Babe Ruth, just not on that kind of a level. Sorry, I think we lost connection for a second there, but I was going to say Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Babe Ruth. Pete's not on that level. He's not inner circle. And that's
No.
why when I say he's become one of the most overrated players ever, it's not he was a bad player. That's ridiculous. No, he was not. He was just not that.
Yeah, being in Cincinnati where I live, and I'm not a Reds fan, right? I had a great argument with a buddy of mine over why I thought Roberto Clemente was better. So we we
Well,
go,
and it's interesting. If you went around the Cincinnati area and you asked people, like, let's not even say baseball, let's just say who is the greatest Reds player of all time? Guarantee you Pete Rose would get what, over 50% of 75%
oh
of
yeah,
the vote.
easy,
And I think you could objectively argue that Johnny Bench was a much better player.
absolutely,
But
no doubt.
that's why I say, again, it's not to denigrate him as a player, but that's why I think he's one of the most overrated players of all time. And it's because of this ban
Yeah,
and the lore of Pete that it just helped him grow so much in stature.
well, and it's such a good segue to the Shoeless Joe conversation because, growing up, my family's originally from Chicago. Oh, they were North Siders. So my dad and I were the only ones who actually kind of had a soft spot for the White Sox. So as a kid getting into baseball history, of course, I read about the Black Sox, and of course, I knew who Joe Jackson was, and what a crime it was that he wasn't in the Hall of Fame. And having the 170 OPS and the 356 average, and the fact that he did well in the World Series that he supposedly threw, and all this other stuff that goes with Joe Jackson. Then we get a really historically inaccurate movie, which did so well with 8 Men Out. And then if you just read Thomas Fountain's book, Betrayal, about that whole thing, you get the real facts of the story. And the Shoeless Joe Jackson, like you're talking about how Pete Rose over the years, because of the ban, has grown into more of a mythical figure, and facts and figures start to change due to public perception. I think Joe Jackson, and again, I love the whole history of the ban and all this stuff and all that because it's part of baseball history. But when you look at the facts here and you look at Joe Jackson as a person and what he did in his life, it really becomes clear that if it wasn't for this scandal, I don't even think he'd be in the Hall of Fame discussion. Do you?
Yeah, he would be on the periphery of
Okay.
the Hall of Fame. Now, let's say he got pushed by a really cool nickname because Shoeless Joe is an amazing nickname.
Yes.
The Black Sox scandal, again, is not too dissimilar from Pete Rose in how his stature grew because of being banned from baseball. And then you've got not only 8 Men Out, but Field of Dreams as well. So many people know who Shoeless Joe is than, for example, Tris Speaker, who was an exponentially better player in the same position in the same era. But like I said, if I looked at WAR, Jaws, he's around 14th among right fielders, and there's like 22 right fielders in the Hall of Fame. So he's probably in, but it's not a complete travesty and not a total miscarriage of justice. I do think that had he not been banned, he would have kept playing, obviously, and he would have kept compiling because his numbers, his hits, I think it was 1,772 hits. That's not enough.
Right.
And you could say, well, his prime got cut short. Well, if he tacked on to that and he got up in the 2000s, that batting average comes down because in your decline phase, your rate stats come down, and he didn't have a chance to do that. It's hard to know where he would have finished. I do think if we said just on the numbers, he's probably worthy of a vote, but it's nothing to knock tables over. He's on the periphery. Like I said, no Tris Speaker, no Ty Cobb, no one but everybody knows Ty Cobb. That's why he's Tris Speaker. But yeah, it was fringe.
Well, and that's again, we do this throughout history, especially in American history, because I always link the history of baseball with American history because they so are entwined in the way people think about even politics. We look at some politicians and we think about how great they were, and then you look back and you're like, not so great.
Yeah.
And so you look at Shoeless Joe Jackson, to your point about the legend of Shoeless Joe Jackson and the fact that, look, hey, his prime was cut short, but that's because he took money to throw a World Series.
Yeah. And it's easy to say, well, he was only in on the meetings. He wasn't actively taking part. And we heard a lot of that about like Buck Weaver and a few of the other ones that 8 Men Out made famous.
Yeah.
It seemed like Seacott was one of the main ones who actually was like actively taking money. And he was interesting because if he didn't get banned, he might have worked his way into the Hall of Fame discussion.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I wrote that down because you said
Yeah,
209 wins, 2.3
yeah.
ERA, and a high WAR. So, like, he was a guy who
He was on
literally
track
because of what he
to
did.
be,
Yeah,
like, alongside an Epa who got in the Hall of Fame
yeah,
eventually. He was kind of like an Epa type. But yeah, it does seem like Joe and Weaver weren't actively involved in the discussions, but they were there and you took money. And it's easy to say, well, if they didn't play bad in the series, well, we see the numbers, but man, if your team's losing, there's nobody on base, and you know, okay, I can get a double here, and it might look a little bit better, but we're still going to lose. You know, I don't think you're absolved of anything if you just look at numbers, especially when it's baseball and a 325 average looks really, really good. And it's not like basketball where you shot 32.5% from the field. That seems a lot more obvious. Like a
yeah.
325 average is great, but you still got out a lot of times.
Yes. Yeah, and you do the numbers, as well as Fountain does in his book. Shoeless Joe in that World Series, by the way, when he because let's talk about his average and in fact he had 2 triples. Those often came when the Reds were down and the game was pretty much decided anyway. So
We're going
you know,
away.
that's what's so fascinating about baseball, and for those of us who love it, is you can go so deep on so many things. But I got to ask you this question in closing, and you talked about obviously how you weigh voting and whatnot. If you were on that committee, you had a vote today, would you vote Pete Rose in?
I would. You can see by my reaction, I don't
Yeah.
know.
Okay.
Um,
That's fine. That's a fair answer.
I would. Here's one thing I would do if I was on the committee. I would be happy, hopefully, to be in there with a lot of current Hall of Famers, and I would want to feel them out and see what they thought, and I would ask them how much they've talked to other Hall of Famers and what they thought. And I know in the Cincinnati area, you're probably familiar with C. Trent, a friend
Mhm.
of mine, and
Had him on the show. Yep.
he said something a little bit back that I latched onto, and I said I want to be like that too. I forget who he said it about, but he said ultimately at the end of the day, I want to be the reason that somebody gets into the Hall of Fame, not one of the reasons that they're prevented from being in the Hall of Fame. And what I have said to people when they talk about some of the PED related guys, A Rod, Manny Ramirez, is I've said I'm a no on A Rod and Manny Ramirez. But if A Rod got over like 2/3 of the vote, and a bunch of fans were hitting me up on Twitter, Blue Sky, Facebook, and saying, please vote for A-Rod, please vote for A-Rod, I probably would.
Mm.
Not because I'm spineless. It's because ultimately I don't look at myself as bigger than the fans. And I look at kind of an arbiter for the fans. And if I think 3/4 of the fans want him in, I don't want to be the one that stands in the way. So
Mm.
I think I would look at it as something like, if almost everybody else wanted Pete Rose in, even if I had personal objections, and to be clear, I do.
Yeah.
Um, but if almost everybody else wanted him in, I'm not the type of guy that's still going to stand in the way and make myself more important than just one vote. And I would go with, hey, everybody else wants him in, so I'm going to vote yes.
Yeah. And you talked about the PED guys. You mentioned 2 there. The big 3, though, when you talk about McGuire, of course, Bonds and Sosa, are those guys moving closer to perhaps getting
I
there,
don't.
or do you think it's just not gonna happen?
I think that the current Hall of Famers don't like the PED era, and so they're always going to be a no on those guys. And to be clear, where my line is, I'm a yes on all those guys: Roger Clemens, Barry Bonds, Mark McGuire, Sammy Sosa, because there was no testing and they weren't
No.
busted when there was testing. So my stance is not. It's not a moral stance. It's never a moral stance. It is. They were not breaking the rules that were in place when they were in place. And you can say, oh, it was against the rules. There was no teeth. It'd be like pulling somebody over for speeding when there's no speed limit. And we don't know who was doing it. We don't know how level the playing field was. We just don't know. So I'm going to judge what we saw on the field. Once there was testing in place, you were actively trying to cheat the system and you got caught trying to cheat the system. Now I'm a no. That's why I'm
Yeah.
a no on Manny, A-Rod. That's why I will be on Ryan Braun and Robinson Cano. But again, if you never got caught when there wasn't anything that they were testing for, then I'm just going to judge what we saw.
Yeah.
So that's where I am on that.
I appreciate that. The last question I have for you too, because I think what I hear from a lot of baseball fans is some frustration and understanding how it's voted on, and you've done a lot to clear that up, I think, today and talking kind of through the
Yeah.
process as you've seen it, but also just about baseball in general. And again, being such a militant baseball guy as I am, I like that the Baseball Hall of Fame is much more selective. And I'm not criticizing basketball or football or any of those other sports with Hall of Fames, but why is it, do you think, that the Baseball Hall of Fame, its voters, its players, why is the voting and the standards much more stringent than perhaps some of the others?
I That's tough. I don't know. I definitely think we do the best job. We've done the best job with the stats and the history and balancing everything. And it's obviously not perfect. I just said I would have been a yes on guys like Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, and Kurt Schilling. Of course, Schilling sealed his own fate, right? Like that, he was a self-saboteur there. But yeah, I still think we do the best job. I don't think we're perfect. We get, I think, probably the most complaints, at least on a percentage of fans basis, which shows that there's a lot of passion there. And I did want to say that so many people among fans, so many people in the media act like it's broken. It's not broken just because you disagree. You can't say the process is broken. Why? Well, because he should be in. Well, that doesn't mean it's broken. We still have a system in place. We have to get to 3/4. That's a really, really high bar to get to 3/4. Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and Kurt Schilling all got to 2/3, but that's not good enough. It's 3/4. That's a really high bar. And if anybody says it's broken, I would say, well, it's just a really high bar. I would challenge anybody to see in any walk of life, can you get 3/4 of people to agree on anything? We would
Correct.
never have a president. We would never have anybody elected if we all had to agree at 3/4 majority on anything. So I think we do the best job. I don't think it's even close to being perfect, but I think we've gotten better in recent years with the transparency and how much people talk about it. And with the Thibs ballot tracker,
Mhm.
I think we can see it gives me, as somebody who likes to know what everybody else is thinking, and I see public reaction to that, that helps me think. For example, I didn't have Felix Hernandez on the ballot this year. There were a lot of people that said, and I've been one of the people pushing for, we need to do better by starting pitchers because the standard should be lowered because they don't throw as many innings now. And there were a lot of people that said, if you want to lower the standards for starting pitchers, why aren't you voting for Felix? And I said, you know what? You're right. I'm going to vote for him next year. I like that kind of a process.
Yeah. No, that's good. It's great that to know that voters, at least some voters, like you, are willing to listen to points and to arguments of why. Because to your point, you're not just the arbiter, right? You're actually listening. Hey, if you have a good argument, if you have a good
Yeah.
point of view that maybe you missed, I'm all for listening to
I
it,
am
right?
not the judge, jury, and executioner. I'm just one member of a 400-person jury, and I'm
Yeah.
going to listen to fans too.
Well, that's great that you take that so seriously because you know how baseball fans take the sport seriously.
Yeah. And that's
So
what I
that's
want.
good.
That's what I want. I was one of those fans for
Yeah.
45 years.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to continue to be a voice for the fans there. And one thing that does drive me crazy is when voters act holier than thou.
Mhm.
I don't have to tell you why I'm voting the way I do. I'm just going to vote screw that, man. Don't do that.
No, I think that's changing with people from our generation and after, so that's a really good sign. But Matt, we certainly appreciate your thoughts. We appreciate your work as always, and you can follow Matt up on X at Matt Snyder CBS and go to cbssports.com to read his stuff. Appreciate you being here, and we'll catch up with you maybe later in the season.
All right.
Thanks for joining us on Big League Buzz, Sportsnaut's MLB podcast. Subscribe wherever you get your audio. And don't forget to follow Sportsnaut on social media. Keep swinging for the fences.